G'day, I'm Yuki-san Dev, and in part 30 of this series, Unity for the Absolute Beginner, we will work on phase 6 of our second game. Alrighty, so we are continuing on from phase 5 where we set up the GUI. Today we will get some sound and particle effects in there. So let's get into it. Okay, so I'm opening up the project where we left off in phase 5. Alrighty, so let's deal with audio first. So we'll start by getting our audio into the project. Now all of these audio files are available in my GitHub, so if you are following along then go and grab them. Otherwise you can always use your own sounds or replace my ones with something else later. So now drag all of this audio straight into your audio folder that we created in the first video and give it a few seconds to process. Okay, and firstly let's put the in-game music in since it's the easiest thing to do. So click on the main camera and let's add a component, audio source, and then click here to assign a clip and we'll assign the game music. Make sure to enable loop and make sure play on awake is also enabled. And we're done. Now whenever the scene loads, it will continuously play the music. Alright, now let's work on the player. So the player will have two sounds. It'll have one for shooting and the other one for dying. The shooting sound we can attach straight to the player prefab, but the player destroyed sound will need to be its own object. You'll see what I mean about that shortly. So drop down your prefabs folder and select player. And we're going to add a component audio source to this. And then we'll assign the player laser to it. And make sure play on awake is toggled off. Now in script we will play this sound for shooting no problem, but if we try to play another sound for the player dying, it's not going to work because the player object is destroyed, so it can't play the sound. So we'll have to make an object that we can instantiate in that will play the sound for us. So right click in the hierarchy and create an empty. And let's name it player destroyed sound. And we'll add an audio source to this one too. And let's assign player die as the clip and make sure play on awake is enabled. Now this object when instantiated is going to stay in the scene forever and that's no good. So let's make a script for it to destroy itself after a few seconds. So right click your scripts folder and create a C# script and name it delayed destroy and drag it onto the player destroyed sound. And now let's open the script. So we just need one quick line in our start method to destroy the object that the script is attached to. So destroy game object, comma 3. So after 3 seconds, the object will be destroyed. So let's save this. And we can just run this real quick and we should hear the in-game music and we should hear the destroyed sound. And then after 3 seconds, the player destroyed sound object should be destroyed. So let's run this. Alright. And I'm going to make a separate folder for the prefab sounds just to keep things organized. And now drag that sound object into your prefabs folder to create an original prefab. And you can delete it from the scene. Okay, we are ready to script these two sounds in for the player, so let's open the player script. Alrighty, so we will need the audio source component to play the laser shot. So private audio source. And we will need a reference to our player destroyed sound object so we can instantiate it in. So serialize field, private game object, destroyed sound. Okay, now in start we need to retrieve the audio source with audio source equals get component, audio source. And now we just navigate down to where we fire a bullet. And we're going to play the sound with audio source dot play. We don't have to specify a particular clip because there is only one to play. Alright, now let's open up our trigger. And before we destroy the objects, let's instantiate the player destroyed sound with instantiate destroyed sound. This will of course spawn in the sound we created earlier and it will play it, and then after 3 seconds it will destroy itself. Alright, let's save this. And click on the player in your prefabs and drag the player destroyed sound into the field we just created in the script. Okay, let's give this a test. Okay, we got sound when we fire, and then when we get hit. Cool. Alright, now on to the enemy. The enemy only has one sound, but again it has to be an object because the enemy will be destroyed and it won't be able to play it. So drag the player destroyed sound prefab that we just made back into the hierarchy, and let's rename it enemy destroyed sound. And change the sound clip from player die to enemy die over here. Then drag the new object back into the prefabs folder and create an original prefab. And delete it from the hierarchy. Alright, and of course the prefab we just created already has the destroy itself script attached, so that should work in the same way. So let's now open the enemy script. And in here we will need a reference to the object again to instantiate it in. So serialize field, private, game object, enemy destroyed sound. And now we navigate down to the trigger. And we're going to put a line in both scenarios here. So the first one, just before the destroy lines, when the enemy is hit enough times to kill it, let's do instantiate enemy destroyed sound. And then in our else statement, let's do the same thing. Cool, so now when the enemy is hit or killed, it will play the sound. So let's save this. And now click on the enemy normal prefab and drag the enemy destroyed sound into the object field we just created in the script. And because the enemy normal is a master prefab, that change should have filtered down to all its variants, but it wouldn't hurt just to check. Cool. Now, the only one that hasn't changed is the Diamond Boss minion, so do the same with that one. Cool, so we're ready to test again, so let's play. And destroy an enemy. Sweet. Alrighty, now on to the boss. So let's click on the Diamond Boss prefab. And let's add an audio source component. And make sure that play on awake is disabled. Now, all of the sounds the boss makes can be scripted in, except the boss getting destroyed for the same reasons as before. So just like the other two sounds, let's make an object for it. So drag one of the existing sound prefabs we made into the hierarchy and rename it Boss Destroyed Sound. And then change its assigned audio to Boss Destroyed. Alright, and now drag that object back into the prefabs folder to create an original prefab. And delete that one from the scene. Alright, we are all set to script in some boss sounds, so let's open the boss script. Okay, and as before, we will need a reference to the Boss Destroyed Sound object, so serialize field, private, game object, Boss Destroyed Sound. And we're going to need the audio source for this one again, so private, audio source, audio source. And we're going to need an array for the audio clips because we're going to use more than one. So serialize field, audio clip, and then 2 empty square brackets, audio clips. Now the line we just put in is cool and we can add as many clips as we like, but I think it might be better if we name them. Otherwise it might get a little confusing knowing which one is which without switching back to the editor each time. So let's change the line to serialize field, audio clip, fire fan, comma, fire circular, comma, fire straight, comma, boss got hit. Alright, now we need to retrieve the audio source and start again. So let's do audio source equals get component audio source. Alright, we have our clips and destroyed sound references, so let's slot them in. So let's navigate down to the boss attacks. So the first one is fire fan. So before the instantiate line, let's do audio source dot play one shot and fire fan, comma 0.2f. So we're playing our fire fan sound at the volume of 0.2f. The reason I dropped the volume on this one is because that sound, I don't think I edited it and it's quite loud. Now to our 2 circular firing routines, we're going to use the same sound. So again, just before each bullet is instantiated, let's do audio source dot play one shot fire circular, and then do the same for the other circular fire in the opposite direction. And finally for our straight down, let's do audio source dot play one shot fire straight. Okay, that's all the firing stuff. Now let's navigate down to the trigger. And before all the other code when the boss is killed, let's spawn in the boss destroyed sound with instantiate boss destroyed sound. And finally, when the boss is hit but not destroyed, let's play a sound with audio source dot play one shot boss got hit. Okay, I think we're ready to give this a test, so let's save this. Alrighty, now click on our Diamond Boss prefab and drag the correct sounds from our audio folder into each slot. And finally, drag the Boss Destroyed Sound prefab into the object slot we created for it. Okay, now click on the Game Manager in the hierarchy and set the starting score to something higher than the last wave requirement so that the boss will just spawn straight in so that we can test it without having to go through the waves. I'm going to change mine to 100 and run. Alright, we'll let the boss do some attacking here. Probably not going to get all the scenarios, but just at least one will do. And now destroy the boss. Boom, there it is. Okay, that's all the sounds done for now. You might have to have a play around with the volumes a little bit to get it to your liking. Now onto the particle effects. So we're going to need an effect for when the enemy is destroyed and when the player is destroyed, and we're going to need one for when the boss is destroyed and one for when the boss gets hit. So we have a few assets to download from the asset store, and yep, they're all free. So click Window and Asset Store. And now do a search for and find the following 3 assets. So you want to look for Star Pack, the Advanced Sparkle System by Antech Studios, Fire Ice Projectile Explosion by MTE Studio, and Potions by Game Plan VFX. And each of the links to these, if you're having trouble finding them, are in my description. So add each one of these to your Unity assets and download them, and then install each one. Each of these asset packs are pretty good, and some of them have some real gems in there. Now, you might get some warnings when you import these. It's not often that every asset pack is compatible with every version of the editor, but for what we're using them for, we should be okay. Alright, after you've installed them, you should see 3 extra folders. You should see Antech, Fire, Ice Projectile Explosion, and GPFX Potions. So drag all of those folders into your imported folder, just to keep things organized. Alright, let's start with the enemy explosion on death. So drop down your imported folder, and then the Antech folder, Star Pack, Samples, Star Pack Demo, and finally Prefabs. And then drag the explosion prefab up into the hierarchy. And let's rename it to Enemy Explosion. Okay, so this explosion is a little large for our game, so let's lock X, Y, and Z and scale it down to 0.3. And make sure in the particle system component that looping is disabled. And let's also drag our delayed destroy script onto it as well, so that after the particle has done its thing, it will remove itself from the scene. Alright, we're ready to drag this into our prefabs. I'm going to make another folder for this called Particles, and drag it in to create an original prefab. And delete it from the scene. Well, since there's only one effect for the enemy, let's just script it in and test it now. So let's open up the enemy script. And in here we're going to need a reference to the prefab that we just made so we can instantiate it in when the enemy is destroyed. So serialize field, private, game object, destroyed particle. And now if we navigate down to our trigger, and in before our instantiate line for the sound, let's do instantiate destroyed particle, comma, transform.position, comma, destroyed particle dot transform dot rotation. Alright, so when the enemy is destroyed, our new particle effect will spawn in at the position of the enemy and the original rotation of the prefab. So let's give this a test. So let's save this. Now click on the enemy normal prefab and drag the new enemy explosion object into the field that we just created. And that change should have filtered down to all the other prefab variants. And then do the same with the diamond boss minion. And let's click on the game manager object and set our score back to 0 so we get some enemies. And let's run this. And shoot some enemies. Boom. There are our explosions. Cool. Alright, now when the player gets hit we need an effect as well, so let's get into our imported folder and drop down Fire, Ice Projectile Explosion and then Prefabs and drag the FX Explosion Blue into the hierarchy and we'll rename it Player Explosion. Right, now drop it down and select all 5 sub-items and then lock XYZ of scale and scale them down to 0.5. And now let's disable the ground element. And again, drag our delayed destroy script onto it. Alright, now we can drag this into our prefab particles folder and create an original prefab. And delete it from the scene. Okay, now let's open our player script. And in here, just like the enemy, we need a reference to the prefab we just made with serialize field, private, game object, destroyed particle. And now navigate down to this trigger. And just before the destroyed sound, let's do instantiate destroyed particle, transform.position, destroyed particle.transform.rotation. So just like the enemy, when the player is destroyed, our new particle effect will spawn in at the position of the player and rotation of the original prefab. So let's save this and click on the player prefab and drag our new player explosion object into the field we created. And let's run this. And let's just get hit by something. Cool. Well, it looks like the explosion could do with a little tweaking, maybe offset it slightly lower. We'll look at that kind of stuff later in the tweaking video maybe. Okay, on to the boss. So the boss will have two effects, one when it's destroyed of course, and the other when it's hit. So let's do the hit one first. So navigate to the prefab we just made for the player explosion and drag it back into the hierarchy and rename it to boss hit effect. And drop it down and disable everything in there except for impact and spark. Alright, that should about do it. So drag the boss hit effect into your prefab particles folder and create an original prefab. And delete it from the scene. Cool. Now for when the boss is destroyed, so drop down your imported folder again and get into the GP VFX Potions pack. And then VFX, VFX Prefabs, GP VFX Magic Prefabs, and finally drag GP VFX Mute into the hierarchy. And rename it to Boss Explosion. Alright, we're going to have to edit this one a little bit. So firstly, disable emission. This will get rid of the golf ball looking thing at the start. Then drop down the object and disable the bubbles and the potion elements. And finally, lock XYZ scale on the remaining two enabled elements and scale them down to 0.5. Right, now I don't think we're going to need to drag the delayed destroy script in on this one because chances are after the boss is killed a new scene would be loading perhaps. We'll look at that later. So drag the boss explosion into our prefab particles folder and create another original prefab. And then delete that from the scene. Alright, now let's get into our boss script. So we need two references to our two new particles with serialized field, private, game object, destroyed particle, comma, hit particle. Alright, let's get down to the trigger, which is where both bits of code will go. So the first condition is when the boss is destroyed. So before the destroyed sound, let's do instantiate destroyed particle transform.position and destroyed particle.transform.rotation. And now the second condition is when the boss was hit but not destroyed yet. So before the sound, let's do instantiate hit particle, comma other.transform.position, comma hit particle.transform.rotation. Alright, so the first condition is pretty self-explanatory. The second one, for the hit particle, you'll notice that we are instantiating the particle at the position of other, which is the bullet. So the particle will play where the bullet actually hit the boss. Okay, so let's save this. And click on the Diamond Boss prefab and you will see the two new containers that we made for the particle effect objects. So drag each one into its slot. So boss explosion into destroyed particle and boss hit effect into hit particle. Now while I'm at it, my boss only requires 2 hits to kill it, so I'm going to change it to 5 so that I can test the hit particle properly. Alright, and let's set a higher score in the game manager again so that we can bypass the waves and get straight to the boss. And let's run this. Right, hit the boss with some bullets and getting the hit effect. And kill the boss. And boom, there it is. Cool bananas. Basic sound and particles done. So what's next? Well, I think at this point we should probably get the menu and the high score table in. So that's probably going to be in the next video. There's a little tweaking to do with these effects, and we'll probably get into that in the tweaking video at the end of the series. But I'm sure you'll have a play around with it anyway. Just one thing to note though, the 3 assets that you've installed might behave a little differently depending on whatever editor version you're using. So if you do run into any issues, do feel free to contact me. So I hope to see you for the next installment of this game series.